The Atlantic slave trade is a dark and horrifying chapter in human history. It was the largest forced migration of people in history, tearing apart families, cultures, and entire nations. The year was 1837. Picture the Arrogante, a brig sailing the Atlantic. Owned by the commercial house of Pedro Martinez and Company, it gained sudden notoriety after being detained by a British cruiser and taken to Jamaica. On board, enslaved Africans transported in the ship's dark, cramped hold accused the crew of unspeakable crimes. The crew was accused of murdering one of the Africans, eating his heart and liver, and serving his remains, his legs and arms, diced into small squares and mixed with rice to feed the others. This is just one of countless tales of unimaginable horror that marked the transatlantic slave trade. But how did it all begin? The Atlantic slave trade started in the 15th century and continued for over 400 years. It was a brutal system of human trafficking, designed to maximize profit with no regard for human life. Enslaved Africans were kidnapped, sold, and forced to endure the horrors of the Middle Passage, a grueling journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Thousands perished due to overcrowding, starvation, disease, and maltreatment, never reaching the lands where they were meant to be sold. The dead were simply thrown overboard, seen as disposable cargo by their captors. The Atlantic slave trade, a triangular horror. The slave trade followed what we now call the triangular trade route. Ships departed from European ports like Lisbon, Bristol, and Liverpool, loaded with goods to trade in Africa. There, European merchants exchanged their goods for human lives. These enslaved men, women, and children were packed into ships like cattle and sent across the ocean to the Americas. The conditions on board were horrific. Disease, malnutrition, and violence claimed the lives of millions. The survivors were then sold as slaves in the Americas, forced into back-breaking labor, often in sugar and cotton plantations. Imagine being taken from your family, stripped of your humanity, and treated worse than animals. The journey alone was a death sentence for many. Those who survived had their lives reduced to relentless toil, abuse, and terror. Enslaved Africans were bought and sold in markets as mere property. Imagine standing on an auction block, your fate decided by how much money you could fetch for plantation owners, traders, and wealthy families. Once sold, they were sent to plantations, where they worked long, grueling hours under the scorching sun. They were whipped, starved, and beaten for the smallest perceived offense. Men were whipped into submission. Women were raped repeatedly, giving birth to children who would never know freedom. Slave masters saw them as livestock, property to be used, abused, and disposed of. Many slaves died young, their lives spent in chains. But even after slavery was legally abolished, illegal slave ships continued to operate. The last illegal slave ship crossed the Atlantic in the 1860s, long after most countries had declared the trade illegal. Despite abolition laws, the profits were too immense, and many governments turned a blind eye as millions more were smuggled into slavery. Breaking down the myths. Most of us learned in school that slave ships followed a triangular route from Europe to Africa to the Americas. But did you know there were also voyages that originated in the Americas, continued to Africa, and returned back to the Americas? The Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Luanda, Angola, Rio de Janeiro route was the largest in the entire slave trade. Newport, Rhode Island, and Charleston, South Carolina in the United States also sent out slave ships. The trade of human lives was an international business, profiting not just Europeans, but also Americans and others around the world. Even after the transatlantic trade was banned, traffickers paid huge bribes to continue their evil business. Atrocities committed in the slave trade. The atrocities committed against enslaved Africans were nothing short of evil. They were beaten, tortured, hung, drawn, and quartered. Some were whipped to death. Others were pulled apart by horses. One of the most horrific practices was on Jamaica's butt-breaking farms, where male slaves were publicly sodomized to humiliate them and break their spirits. Children, too, were subjected to unimaginable abuse. Children as young as 5 were raped, beaten, and sold like livestock. They were often used as bargaining chips, separated from their families, and forced into lives of misery. The abolition of slavery. Though the trade was eventually abolished, it took decades of pressure, protest, and uprising. By the early 1800s, many countries began questioning the legitimacy of the trade. But it wasn't until the 1830s that nations like the United States, Britain, and France finally outlawed it, though by then, the damage had already been done. Yet the legacy of the slave trade lives on. The scars left on descendants of the enslaved run deep. The slave trade didn't just steal lives, it stole cultures, languages, and histories. Entire generations were lost. The legacy of the slave trade. To this day, the legacy of slavery affects millions around the world. African women contributed significantly to the gene pool in the Americas, often because they were raped by their masters. In Latin America, the impact of enslaved women on the gene pool was as much as 17 times greater than men. Their bodies were systematically exploited for centuries, giving birth to children who would never know freedom. The slave trade wasn't just a stain on history, it's a reminder of how far humans can fall. But by remembering the horrors, we ensure that these atrocities are never repeated.